Deathloop's launch smashed all expectations, with its stylish action-heavy gameplay quickly making it the standout game of the year, and Arkane's highest rated title of all time. But its reputation has changed a lot over the last few years, leaving it as arguably Arkane's most debated title, ignoring the disaster that is Redfall obviously. So what happened to Deathloop? Well, it sort of starts at the end of Dishonored 2, with studio founder Rafael Colantino asked by Bethesda to try something else, and this something else would eventually lead to two Arkane studios releasing two games, Prey and much later Deathloop. And while Prey was an incredible game, it failed commercially, with a stacked release, questionable reviews, and arguably one of the worst marketing campaigns I've ever seen from a major studio. Something Arkane clearly learned from for Deathloop's launch, as it became the undisputed game of the year, though it really was the game of the year. See, the global lockdown meant that 2021 was arguably one of the, if not the worst year of gaming I can remember, with Deathloop's biggest competition being Metroid, Ratchet & Clank, and Forza. All great games, but a far cry from the competition both Dishonored and Prey had released to. Now that doesn't take away from the fact that the launch reviews were still really high. So what was it about Deathloop that had reviewers so hyped? Well, I have to start with Colt. His energy is amazing, and quite different from Arkane's usual leads, with great voice acting and writing. I mean, just hearing him interact with himself, both through the messages and doppelgangers, really helps sell the character. The same is true for Juliana, who adds some spice to the interactions, and their dynamic is the real driving force in the story, with just enough humour, plot and edge to their conversations to keep things flowing, without ever feeling awkward or dull. They are just some of the best designed characters, not just in an Arkane game, but period. Right up there with the likes of Handsome Jack and Kiryu for me. And speaking of great design, Deathloop's retro-futuristic setting is a total vibe. You can feel the style of the world right from the many menus in the game to the world itself. It's especially noticeable if you've played a lot of Arkane's games and are more used to that dark, gritty style they're known for, which is still here, it's just a little out of the way this time. And unlike other Arkane games, which some can argue take time to get going, Deathloop just throws you right in, letting you experience all of this from basically the opening sequence, though it does hold your hand for a little too long. Yes, it's not as mind-bendingly creative as other Arkane openings, but it wastes as little time as possible, making it clear that this isn't Dishonored with guns, it's Deathloop. And unlike Dishonored, there's only one objective and one way to play: full chaos. You could argue it's a dumbed down system, but I get why they did this. It makes you more willing to try out the full arsenal Deathloop provides you, without worrying about a bad ending or morality systems from other games. It lets Arkane really smooth out the gameplay, which you can really feel in the weapons, powers and equipment. Nothing feels bad to use, though it's not all perfect, but more on that later. Now, I did say earlier that Deathloop has great design, but its level design is lacking. Despite playing this game multiple times, none of the locations ever felt that memorable or stand out. Sure, they all look good and have the pathways you'd expect from an Arkane game, but nothing here feels real or has flow. It's like an AI designed these levels based off Arkane's designs. There's not a lot of care to how things are placed or if it makes sense for the world, or the AI, but more on that later. Now, I get what you might be saying, this isn't Dunwall or Arks, it's a time loop island. And sure, you're right, but they don't really lean into this either. The world is very fixed, nothing ever really changes, and sure, there's slight differences in the day-night cycle, but nothing major, leaving a beautiful world that feels disconnected and kind of empty, in a way I've never really felt from an Arkane game before. And maybe a large part of that is how boring the Visionaries are. I never connected to Deathloop's surrounding cast, and no amount of dialogues or recordings or notes changed that. They're just names and places with designs that barely even stand out from the regular mobs. I mean, just compare any of them to that rich dude from Dishonored or the freezer chef from Prey. These characters were minor, barely even mentionable in those games, but I bet you still remember them, right? But that's not the case here, and I think a large part of that is the lack of tension and interaction between Colt and the Visionaries, or really anyone other than Juliana. Deathloop's opening makes it clear how everything will unfold, so there's never any tension in the story, which on its own is fine, but mixed with the lack of interaction meant I never really connected or cared about anyone but Colt and Juliana. Now, you could argue that's the point, but the game does seem to want to try and make the sidecast actual characters, with motives in the side content. It just never really commits to building that relationship. Like, why aren't there any cutscenes with Colt and the Visionaries? With how good the writing is, I'm sure they would have been great, and made the process of tracking and hunting each of them way more memorable. Now let me get this out the way. Deathloop isn't a roguelite, but it does have some elements in its time loop system, those being the Residuum, Slabs and weapons. And while it's all mostly good, Arkane have definitely made some questionable decisions here. Starting with the Residuum, which is nicely woven into the story and gameplay. I was worried it might be grindy, but you get it at a good rate, and with recycling it's never an issue. Which is great, but it exposes the game's weapon system. Like, why is there a rarity loot system here? It works in games like Borderlands because the player level system exists there, which means even if you get lucky, you'll still outgrow the weapon and try other ones, while chasing that next high. But here, the moment you get something good, you're set for the rest of the game, and it doesn't even have to be a legendary, since rare guns feel just as good. But what it does do is bloat the weapons in the game, leaving nothing that really stands out or feels very memorable. As for the Slabs, it's surprising that a game about a time loop with all that potential, the best slabs are Blink and Reprise, both of which you get really early on, and there isn't really a reason to use any of the others. With the exception of Havoc, they're not really that interesting, or useful enough to replace in the 2 slots that you have, which is something I wish Arkane had been a lot more flexible with. I would have gladly given up the grenade or secondary weapon slot, or heck even both, for one more slab slot, and it would have opened up way more variety in the way the game can be played. Just compare the crazy compilations from the Dishonored games to the ones from Deathloop and you'll see what I mean. As for the hacking tool, it's fine, but it really becomes way more useful once you realise that you don't need line of sight to hack, just to start, which is something I'm shocked wasn't explained because it makes using hack turrets way more fun, if a little too overpowered. Like, one of my go-to strategies was just to set up a turret stack and bait the AI over. It never failed, even if it was kind of boring. And this brings me to some of my biggest problems with Deathloop. It's repetitive without any real meaningful payoff until the end, if even then depending on how you feel about the endings. Like, once you've done a few takedowns, the game spoils exactly what to do and how to do it. There's never any twist or attempt to shake up the narrative in any interesting way. Now, this might not have been a problem if the gameplay was fun, and yeah, it is, for the first few hours, but it never evolves beyond that. Once you get a good setup, you realise the game plays basically the exact same from start to end, in the same levels, which all end up feeling the same, regardless of the time of day. And a big reason for that is the AI. It's really bad, especially in the more open outdoors areas, which is why I mentioned earlier that Arkane's level design only really further punishes them. They can't handle verticality or range, and I see what Arkane tried to do here with the short range arsenal forcing you to play more up close, but it just doesn't work with how so many of the levels are designed and how bad the AI pathfinding is. Something you would think that enemy variety might be able to change, maybe through a shield type or bruises that you normally see in these type of games. But there's none of that here. Sure, there's a few special types including the AI Juliana, but they all act the same as regular mobs and never really force you to change your playstyle. It's just a real shame because it wastes the game's strong start and leaves a boring mid-game that doesn't really make you want to stick around. I get it's hard to make good AI, but more indoor sections might have helped here, and I don't really believe that Arkane was actually expecting the PvP mode to provide most of the challenge. So what's next for Arkane and Deathloop? Well, with Redfall and Prey's lack of sales, it's probably Dishonored 3, but after that I can see a Deathloop 2, and with more time to expand on the mechanics and story, there's a lot of potential in the IP.